Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome again to this quantitative history webinar series. So today we have Professor Max Hao from Peking University, Beijing Daxue School of Economics. So he is Associate Professor of Economics at the PKU. Of course, before he joined Peking University back in 2013, 2014, he got his PhD in economic history from the University of California, Davis. During his dissertation time, he worked on surnames and social mobility. And then since then, he has published at least 2 papers in this area of using surnames to examine the history of social mobility in China and other countries. After he joined Peking University, he has worked on a variety of different topics in addition to surnames and social mobility. As you will see today, he's going to share his research that has been done in 3 different papers, focusing on the lessons learned from 3 fiscal reform experiments during the Qing dynasty, China. From his talk today, you will see that as much as most of us think that the Qing dynasty China had this imperial system where the emperor was supposed to have all the power in the world, but nonetheless, that power did not translate into real high state capacity, at least in terms of how much fiscal revenue, how much taxation the Qing government was able to raise. Based on that metric, the Qing government was not able to really do that much. So today, Professor Hao will share with us his research in this area, trying to explain why that was the case. So just like before, in terms of the format for today's webinar, Professor Hao will speak for about an hour, and then we have Professor Weijia Li from Monash University in Australia to give a discussion for 10 to 15 minutes. Then my colleague, Professor Zhichen Ma, will take it on from there to organize and moderate the Q&A part of today's webinar. So without further ado, of course, so while Professor Hao talks, feel free to submit your comments and questions in the Q&A box. And then at the end, Professor Ma will collect questions and read questions for Professor Hao to answer. Okay, so that's the basic format and also just the quick introduction. So now, without further ado, let me turn it over to Professor Hao.
Thank you very much, Professor Chen, for the nice introduction. And thank you for having me to here to report 3 papers, 1 published already, and 2 are work in progress and very preliminary works. Hopefully I can get some useful comments and suggestions. They are very welcome. And thank very much Weijia Li for agreeing to discussing this paper and offering many insights, theoretically in particularly. Now I'm gonna share the screen. Okay. Okay, so the problem I'm gonna focus is the commitment problem within bureaucracy. Lessons from 3 failed fiscal rationalization reforms. The first one is 火耗归公, the fiscal reform in 1720s, and the second one happened in the middle of Qianlong area period, 1785, the centralization of Yanglianying. The third one is about the rationalization reform after the Taiping Rebellion. So basically, these three reforms will take you into a journey of the whole Qing physical history. And I'm going to show that commitment failure within bureaucracy will repeat itself time from time all through the Qing period. Okay, so the main story goes as follows. During much of the Qing period, the central government collected most of the formal land tax, didingying and caoliang. In the meantime, provincial and county governments relied on unsupervised informal levies to finance the regular and irregular expenses. By regular expenses, I mean the salaries paid to officials, staff, clerks, and runners. By irregular expenses, I mean public good expenses, schools, famine relief, grain granaries, bridges, something like that. But all these expenses, most of the expenses were financed not by formal land tax, instead by informal levies. So because of the informal levies were unsupervised, it can cause severe corruption and frequent tax protests by the commoners. So the state did make several attempts to solve this problem. How do they do that? They allowed local governments to collect a fixed amount of land tax, land surtax, 正式的附加税, which were shared among the provinces and counties, and were spent on specific expenditure items. I will show this in great details in the next few slides. And this was viewed as physical rationalization reforms, which was thoroughly studied by Zheng Xiaoping in 1984. The term rationalization came from Max Weber. Actually, that means physical transparency. Physical transparency. How much was the tax rate? How much the central government get? How much the provincial and county governments get? And what are these incomes, physical revenues were spent? They are all transparent. That term defines physical rationalization or physical transparency. However, these reform attempts were doomed to fail without solving the commitment problem within bureaucracy. In particular, physical transparency made it easier for the upper governments to collect lower revenues. In Chinese term, 上收财权, or divert lower revenues to upper expenditures, to assign the lower governments to pay for upper expenditure that should have been being covered by upper revenues. That means 下放实权. And such commitment failure will force the EU-financed local governments to extract excessive informal levies from the peasants, which ultimately caused tax revolts. So this phenomenon is also observed by contemporary observers such as Huang Zongxi, and summarized as follows. Reforms intended for eradicating informal levies will only end up with even more informal levies. That is also known as Huang Zongxi law or Huang Zongxi 定律. In what aspects that my study will contribute to, I have two contributions basically. The first is the commitment problem in historical development of state capacity, and most of the studies are based on evidence or lessons from pre-modern Europe, in which case the geopolitical environment forced the states to fight against each other, and to survive, a state must be strong enough and be able to collect a higher share of physical income to the center. So that basically promoted physical centralization across the entire Europe. And the countries or city-states who wouldn't be able to do that will be defeated and will be dissolved by larger states. But physical centralization created a commitment problem, mostly between the crown and the elites, between the states and the parliament, because the parliament would not believe that, would not be willing to pay taxes to the crown unless they know their revenues would not be spent on unnecessary wars and unnecessary expenses, such as great palace or something like that. So the physical centralization created conflicts between the states and the parliament, which resulted in political change towards limited governments. Most prominent one was the Glorious Revolution in England, where the parliament get the power to authorize the crown's budget and crown's expenditures. But no studies have been made concerning commitment problem within the bureaucracy. Most of the studies are basically commitment problem between the society and the state, not one within bureaucracy, except for Ma and Rubin's paper in 2018, published in Journal of Comparative Economics. The second source of, the second lines of literature I'm going to contribute is the source of weak physical capacity in pre-modern China, which is related to great divergence. The first factor is the absence of interstate competition, which make the state lack the motivation to raise taxes and issue public debts. Another consequence of absence of interstate competition was the elite lacked bargaining power to obtain representation simply because they could not exit. Okay, so this is a recently published paper by Zheng and Wang Yuhua in Journal of Comparative Politics. And the second big factor is the geographic size. So Sun Chuanwei and his co-author have these two papers, one theoretically and second one empirically, states the idea that weak monitoring capacity came from the large geographic size. So with weak capacity, the state have to levy low formal tax rate and tolerate corruption, simply because they cannot, the state cannot monitor their agents. And there are other sources such as ideology. The Qing government in particular, the Qing government was not only competing with other countries, but also competing with formal dynasties, right? So low tax rate was the source of legitimacy. And there were the last one, not the least one, was the coordination from local elites, facilitated by the Keju system. So with Keju system, the local elites have the incentive to provide public goods, and they have no incentive to rebel. So the state could outsource local public goods to local elites with trusts. So I myself have a paper co-authored by Liu Zhengcheng, Weng Xi, and Zhou Lian recently published in JEH. But commitment problem within bureaucracy was not well studied until very recent. To be more clear, I'm going to talk about a principal agent problem. But in this problem, information asymmetry was not a cause. It will be a consequence. To illustrate that, in Sun Chuanwei's paper, information asymmetry and monitoring capacity were exogenous in size. In Ma and Rubin's framework, information asymmetry, monitoring capacity, and even nation size are essentially endogenous in institution. How was that? The absolute ruler had to maintain a weak monitoring capacity and tolerate agents' corruption ex innate, because a ruler under physical transparency with full rationalization of physical system would confiscate the legal and formal income of the agent ex post. So essentially, the absolute ruler have to satisfy the agent's participate constraint by keeping his eyes blind. So I have created this slogan: keep my eyes blind because I cannot keep my hands tied. So that is the paradox of the absolute ruler. So the basic idea is very similar to Qian Yi's work using decentralization as a commitment. But in Qian's study, decentralization was conducive to economic development because the local governments have more incentive to promote economic growth. But in our case, decentralized as a commitment was an obstacle to greater physical capacity. So the consequence was bad. Okay, in the next 45 minutes, I'm gonna talk about my three papers, 15 minutes for each one. The first paper is already published 2020 in EHR. So the paper is actually a salute to Zheng Xiaoping's work, 周宪官的赢量. So the basic idea is that before the reform, the center government actually collected most of the formal taxation to the center. Actually, there were retained, there were a portion of formal taxes retained at the local level, but those retained revenues were actually intended for expenditure of the central government, such as military expenses, such as postal stations. So they were actually expenditure by the central government, not the county governments. So to finance the local governments, the counties will typically collect 50% of formal land tax as extra legal levies. So the rate actually differed from one place to another, but on average, the rate would be 50%. That would be 15 million silver taels. And half of the actual levies were actually spent at the local level, at the county level. And the counties will submit the rest 50% as tributes to the provincial government, as to finance the regular and irregular expenses by the provinces. We have a name for that, 漏规. So after the reform, so Emperor Kangxi actually know everything. He knew everything about what the provinces and counties do, but he chose not to interfere with the local governments. Whereas his son, Yongzheng, after his succession of the crown, started a national level reform, province by province, to formalize these extralegal levies. How did they do that? He formalized extralegal levies, and instead he authorized the county government to collect a formalized surtax, 12% of the formal land tax. The rate will be deferred across regions, but the average rate was 12%. That add up to 3.6 million formalized surtax. And the counties will keep half of the surtax at a local level and spend at a local level, whereas he will submit the rest half to the provinces. The provinces will have two expenditure items. One is provincial public funds, which is supposed to spend on public goods across the provinces. The other 0.5 million silver taels goes to provincial government fee, 省养廉营, or 督府养廉营, in order to cover the regular expenses of the provincial government. So Yongzheng actually have a very simple idea to 政富以供国用，号线以养廉元. Literally means the formal tax are providing the states, the central government, whereas the surtax are supposed to feed the local governments, right? So actually this reform is a kind of a tax sharing reform, 财政分权改革, tax sharing reform. What's the impact on famine relief? Well, before the reform, the provincial and county governments had no control over formal land taxes. And even worse, with decentralized informal levies, counties could not coordinate a large-scale relief across regions. Besides, the county governments and provincial governments had no incentive to use informal levies to conduct famine relief. Why? Because they kind of have this residue claim over informal revenues, right? The top priority of the local governments is to collect tax and submit to the central government. So the key priority was to maintain government. And after that, they will turn residue income into personal pockets. And after that, they will have concerns about public goods. So instead of using money, their informal levies to finance famine relief, the provincial and county governments actually mobilize local elites to donate money to conduct famine relief, right? That's why we observe that before the reform, the disaster, the time trend of famine relief was way below disaster. And after 70-20s, the famine relief goes up and became more and more responsive to disasters. And the number of disaster actually also goes up. The reason might be that before the reform, the local governments have no incentive to report famines, because if you report famines, you have to deal with that, but you don't have money to do that, and you don't want to use your own money to do that. So they have no incentive to report famines. But after the reform, the provincial governments actually pooled financial resources as public funds to conduct famine relief. And also with transparency, the provincial governors have no excuse to divert public funds into other expenses. So we test this hypothesis by this empirical specification we have family relief, the frequency of family relief on the left side. On the right hand, we have exceptional disaster interact with reform status. If you finish the reform, the value goes to 1. So by exceptional disaster, I mean exceptional droughts or exceptional floods happen in that particular prefecture. The results show that basically a prefecture after reform will conduct 1 more family relief under the circumstances of exceptional disaster, which explain 30% of its standard deviation. And the impact was even greater for exceptional disaster than in case of limited disaster than normal weathers. And moreover, we have this test for pre-trend parallel pre-trends, which indicates that the timing of the reform was largely exogenous to the probability of getting family relief. Okay, we also explored the mechanism, provincial physical capacity as the main mechanism. We still have this key explanatory variable, and we also interact our explanatory variable with several variables. In the first line, we show that the impact was no greater with higher value of county government fees, because the county government fees are retained and spent by the county governments. It has nothing to do with higher level provision of public goods. Secondly, we show that the impact was stronger if greater share of the formalized surtax were remitted to the provinces. And lastly, we show that the impact was stronger with provincial public funds being greater share of formalized surtax, because in both cases, the variable actually are related to the resources pooled by the provincial governments. Also, we test the idea that the reform enhanced intertemporal smoothing and interregional risk sharing. We show that the impact was greater in case of exceptional flood, in which case immediate intervention was needed, than in case of droughts. We also show that the impact was stronger in areas with greater difficulty of taxation. So we interact exceptional disaster with reform status with the dummy variable difficulty of taxation, P, 重返 P 难, P, suggesting interregional risk sharing. The counties with greater difficulty of taxation was not able to conduct family relief with its own resources. But after the reform, with pool resources, the provinces will make essentially transfer payment from richer area to poorer area. Okay, but what happened later was that the Qianlong emperor, after he succeeded the crown, actually keep more control over provincial revenues. And there are more and more cases where the central government appropriate provincial public funds into central use, or transfer one province's public fund to another provinces for in times of emergency. Okay, so there this appropriation have two consequences. First, it will reduce the famine relief by the provincial governments, as we showed in this table. The second consequence is that the province will tend to divert its burdens to county government, to the lower governments, by assigning county government fees to provincial purposes, as shown in column 3 and 4. We actually have this data, collect this data from 第一历史档案馆 by searching the titles of the reports of the governors to the Ministry of Finance, 户部题本. We simply search the title and collect the information on the time and place on provincial level. Okay, so not before long, the tax sharing and physical tax sharing was kind of destroyed by the central and the provincial governments. Okay, so this is the first paper, and in last 2 years, I read this book 为政之共 by historian Zhou Jian, and we decided to move on to later periods of Qing to see what happened next. Okay, so the second paper is about a centralization reform in 1785. So what did the reform do? Before the reform, the county governments retained half of the formalized surtax at the local level, locally collected and locally spent. But Qianlong had this vision that the county government fee were spent at local level. That created a lot of problems. County governments will embezzle these revenues to other expenses or to simply put them into personal pockets. So that was very bad. That has to be banned. So Qianlong made the decision to submit all the formalized surtax to the provinces. So, and then county government fee will be transferred back from a provincial governor back to the counties, right? So after the reform, the fiscal regime became 收支两条线. Okay, so the provinces centralized all the formalized surtax and will make transfer payments back to the county governments. So what are the consequences? The first consequences is that it was even more, even easier for provinces to appropriate county government fee. Before the reform, the provinces must assign the county governments to pay for higher expenses. But after the reform, the provinces could simply refuse to transfer county government fee to the counties. So in Zhou Jian's book, he actually documented a lot of cases where the provinces actually refuse to transfer the government 州县养廉营 county government fee. The reasons are various. Some of the reasons are actually related to central government expenses, such as huge military expenses, 白莲教起义, 天理教起义, and 连州教费, something like that. But some of the, and also Jia Qing's tour to Wutaishan, actually they were supposed to be paid by the central government, but the central government shifted the burden to the provinces, who in turn shifted the burden to the counties. But some other expenditures are actually provincial, such as 津贴购价 or 米谷亏空. They're actually provincial expenses, they were shifted. The burden was shifted by to the counties. And what happened next is that the counties started to collect new extralegal levies and started to submit more logui to the provinces. So everything went back to the situation before the reform in 1720s. Okay, so in Zhou Jian's book, he also document a case in Zhejiang. So the actual surtax rate would go as high as 60% for Didingying. That's 60%. Way above the legalized surtax rate, 12%, right? And the surtax rate would be even higher for grain tax, 草粮. The surtax rate could go as high as 100%, right? 100% per shi. So again, the counties would collect new extralegal levies and submit logui to the provinces, but most of the revenues will actually goes to the personal pockets of governors, magistrates, clerks, runners, etc. So we have this very famous description of Qing's corruption: 3年清知府10万雪花银. That means if you take a job as a county magistrate for 3 years, you're gonna obtain an income of 10,000 of silver taels. So I'm gonna talk about the data patterns and data source. Okay, so before the reform, so the first data actually was the case of diverting county revenue by the provinces. It was documented by it was reported to the central government if you do that. Okay, so we search keywords 摊扣养廉、摊捐养廉、动支养廉, and we get 800 cases in total. And before the reform, the trends between the high county revenue provinces and low county revenue, 就是养廉营比较高的省和养廉营比较低的省, are quite similar, right? The trends are parallel, the size are similar. But after the reform, the high county government fee group goes up. Secondly, we document the cases of the excessive tax extractions, 浮收案件. So again, in this in the 历史馆数据库, we have all kinds of cases where people are accusing the government to overtax. Okay, so we have the keywords 浮收、乐折、私派, and a couple of other keywords, and we got 470 cases throughout this period. So before the reform, the frequency of such cases were low, and there were no trends, no difference in the trends between the two groups, groups in terms of county government fees. But after the reform, the high shock group goes up. So this is illustrative of our empirical strategy. So our empirical framework is as follows. Centralization of county government fees to the provinces made it easier for provinces to divert county government fees by withholding transfer payments back to the counties, which resulted in counties extracting more extralegal levies, which ultimately leads to more tax revolts. So our empirical stratification is a DID setting with the outcome variable on the left-hand side. And the right-hand side, we have this interaction between the logged county government fees interact with post 7085. So the treatment variable is actually county government fees. The logic is that the larger size of county government fees, the greater the probability of it being retained by the provincial governments, and the greater impact on county's regular expenses, and the greater the probability of county to levy extralegal levies. So we have the geographic distribution of county government fee, 养廉营的这个 size. There are a huge regional variation, and the baseline results is as follows. It basically says that if county government fees doubled, then after the reform, the case of actual legal levies will goes up by actually 3%. Okay, that actually explains over 100% of the mean of the dependent variable. And here is the dynamics of impacts. So before the reform, there was no difference between the control, the treated group and the control group. And after the reform, the trends between them diverges. And more importantly, the parameter of coefficient actually goes up to 1 after 1795, when the central government started to launch national military campaign, such as 白莲教旗 and other huge expenses. Okay, and before the reform, the central government also have this military campaign, such as 大小金川战役, but before the reform, such central military campaign did not create a difference between a difference in tax actual legal levies between high government high 养廉营 group and low 养廉营 group. So that is reassuring of our results. We also try to deal with the endogeneity of our independent variable by introducing IV. So the IV is actually the same as the IV used by Peking and Jia Ruixue in their econometric paper. We use the number of small rivers to instrument for county government fees. So the first stage results are reported here. And in second stage results, we show that the magnitude of impacts actually doubled relative to the OLS result. Okay. And also we try to identify the mechanism. Okay, so we use the same independent variable, but instead of using actual levies, we replace the Y by the case of diverting county government fees by the provincial government. So this regression is at provincial level, okay? Because we only have provincial level for the dependent variable. So again, a higher government fee, a higher 州县养廉营 resulted in greater chance of diverting county government fee after the reform, okay? And finally, we test the impact on tax revolts. And the results are also positive and significant. And the magnitude was not big, but it actually add up to 70% of the mean of the frequency of tax revolts. Okay, so that's the second paper. Okay, the final paper concerns what happened in the very late Qing, in the last 2 decades of Qing. The title goes as "The Curse of Transparency." How did shifting physical burdens raise tax revolts? So in this paper, we use tax revolts as dependent variable because we have greater quality data on tax revolts in the last 2 decades of Qing, whereas we don't have such good quality data on the mechanism variable. Okay, I will show you later. So what happened after the Taiping Rebellion? Okay. First of all, the green arrows show the formal tax or the tax controlled by the central government, including Huohao, because Huohao was actually already a centralized tax. So the counties instead collect a lot of informal levies to deal with the financial difficulties. But after the Taiping Rebellion, a new kind of a tax sharing regime was established between the center, province, and the counties, because the center obtained a new source of revenue, 海关税, which was organized and administrated by He De and other professionals. And secondly, the provinces collect a new kind of commercial taxes, 厘金. And 80% of 厘金 was retained at the provincial level, whereas 20% of 厘金 will be submitted to the central government or to be transferred from one province to other provinces. So basically, 厘金 at that time became the major source of the provincial revenues, which financed modernization projects and modern armies. But what happened to the counties? In this time, the provincial governments promotes a reform that legalized a new surtax that was positively linked to the formal land tax quotas, which is known as 前朝盈余. 前朝盈余. It's a kind of a new surtax. So in Zhou Jian's book, he called this reform as a second time 号线归公, 第二次号线归公, because the basic idea was exactly the same. And Li Hongzhang had this longer version of Yongzheng's words. Remember Yongzheng's words? 为政政府以供国用, 号线以养廉源. So basically, what Li Hongzhang said is a longer repetition of Yongzheng's words. But what happened after 1900, when the central government have to pay huge war indemnities and a lot of expenditure related to modernization, known as 行政? How did center pay for that? First of all, the central government raised the share of 厘金 to the center from 20% to over 80%. And also, the central government asked the provinces to submit a part of 前朝盈余 to the provinces in order to pay for the indemnity, right? So the provinces shifted the burden of war indemnities and modernization projects to counties. And the amount of burden was in proportion to formal land tax quotas. The amount of burden in that time was called 摊派. 摊派. I'm going to show you that the number of 摊派 was in proportion of formal land tax quotas. So this pattern is very important to our empirical strategy. Zhou Jian also in his book summarized the case of province by province, how the central government shifted its burden to provinces and counties. So our empirical strategy here was similar to the last one, with very little variation. So the center shifted to the provinces the burden of war indemnities, and the burden shifted was in proper proportion to quotas of formal land taxes, which in turn induced the counties to extract more extralegal levies, which ultimately result in tax revolts. So at this time, we use quotas of formal land tax as the treatment variable. And the interaction between post-1900 and treatment was our key explanatory variable. And we have data over 22 years of 200 prefectures. But for the channel, for the mechanism, we don't have high quality data at prefecture level over the years. Instead, we utilized a detailed cross-sectional data in 1909 for Henan province. So the data was abstracted by from Qing Caizheng Shuomin Shu, very detailed books about physical revenues and expenditures, province by province. Okay, so the baseline results are as follows. We use a formal land tax tax in silver, 地丁银, as a treatment variable, and we find that a greater doubling land tax in silver will result 0.06 more frequency in tax revolts, which is basically 22% of the mean of the tax revolt. And we replaced the dependent variable by tax revolt occurrence, but the results are similar. We also run this dynamics of impacts, and the results are showing that before 1900, the impact of land tax in silver was not significant. But only after 1900, it turns positive. Okay. Then we use land tax in green, 漕粮, as the key treatment variable. The results were not as clean as the last one. The dynamic impact shows that the positive impacts happened mainly after 1907. This is consistent with the fact that most of the 摊派 of 养廉营 of 前曹盈余 were actually based on silver tax before 1907. After 1907, the central government started to 摊派 based on 漕粮 quota. So there were new kinds of 漕粮摊派 after 1907 in order to finance the new armies, basically. So the impact on this different treatment variable actually turns up only after 1907. We also use exactly the same IV as in the previous paper. In both cases of silver land tax and green land tax, we show that in second stage, that the impact of the 摊派 actually goes up. Actually, the magnitude doubled relative to OLS estimates. Now, let me turn to mechanisms. The data we have is a cross-sectional level data for one province, Henan provinces. In Henan province, the book actually documented each time how much tanpai, how much burdens are shifted to each county by county. There are a couple of tanpai from actually 1875 all the way to 1875 all the way to 1911. There are a couple of tanpai. Some of them are temporary, some of them are permanent. Based on the calculation, I calculate tanpai within the first decade of 20th century, the yearly average tanpai, and I run cross-sectionally on formal land tax in silver and formal land tax in green, and also I controlled prefectural fixed effect, and it shows that the results show that doubling formal land tax in silver will result in a 132 percentage higher in terms of tanpai. That was a very large magnitude. So I sum up all the tanpai, and it turns out that average tanpai was 300 million silver taels, which amount to 8% of formal land taxes and 50% of the formal land surtaxes. So 50% of Qiancao Yingyu was tanpai, was submitted as shifted burden to the provinces and the central government. What happened next is that counties extract more extralegal levies. So in Henan provinces, we can actually have a very detailed data on two types of extralegal levies. One is zajuan, the other is guifei. So zajuan literally means new informal levies intended for public goods. Guifei means new informal levies intended for government, county government fees. So similarly, we find that a higher formal land tax in silver and in green was positively related to more higher magnitude of zajuan and guifei. But in regression concerning zajuan, if we control educational expenditure, this parameter turns insignificant. But in case of guifei, including education expenditure does not affect the size and significance of the key explanatory variables, which is consistent with our hypothesis that county extracted more actual levies to finance government fees, to finance the local governments. So totally, the reported informal levies, the sum of zajuan and guifei, were actually 120,000 silver taels, which is only 46% of the submitted formal land surtaxes. But that total must be much less than the actual number, because we already know that educational expenditure was as high as 440,000 silver taels. So these numbers must be only a small proportion of the total informal levies collected during that time. Okay, let me summarize my studies in these tables. I actually summarized the whole Qing tax sharing among the central, the province, and the counties. So we have a couple of rationalization reform, but as soon as there was commitment failure between the central, the province, and the counties, meaning that the central try to appropriate lower government revenues or divert lower revenues to higher expenditures. The lower government, in response, had to levy new informal levies to finance its own expenses. So that's my whole story. And the story repeats itself time and time all through throughout the Qing period, all the way to the end of the Qing dynasty. But what happened next after 1911? Actually, we have a similar case in the Ming dynasty, a single whip reform. Qin Hui and Liu Guangling also wrote on this, but there were very little quantitative works. I'm currently working on this right now, but the results are too preliminary to report. But after 1911, we have a couple of other studies on the similar issues. For example, in Caili Gaitong reform, the central government centralized all Lijing to the provincial government as tongshui, and allow the lower governments, the provincial governments, to collect a new types of 营业税, commercialization, commercial taxes. But in the end, after 1940, the central government submit all the provincial commercial taxes to the center, forcing the local governments, to the provincial governments, to collect new surtaxes. So it is very similar to the case in Qing. And also, we have very similar results as for fiscal rationalization in 1994, a rural fee-to-tax reform by the turn of the 19th century, and the abolition of agriculture tax in early 21st. And of course, we have this ongoing business tax to value-added tax reform. But all this reform, after all this reform, it was found that local public provision was reduced after fiscal rationalization. The reason was that the upper governments did not make sufficient transfer payments back to the local governments in order to compensate for their loss in fiscal rationalization. In response, the lower governments have to lower public goods or even to resort to other informal incomes, such as 土地出让收入 or 罚款 or something like that. So we find that the similar problem, the commitment failure within bureaucracy, actually repeated itself from 17th century all the way to the very current day. That would be my findings. Thank you all for listening, and that'll be all for my part.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Hao. Now let's turn to the discussion section. Today, we are very honored to have Professor Weijia Li from Monash University, Department of Economics, to discuss Professor Hao's presentation. Professor Li also studied the political economy of economic history, especially in the context of China, including the fiscal capacity and the related issue. So Professor Li, you will have 10 to 15 minutes to discuss Professor Hao's papers. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ma, for the nice introduction. So it's quite an honor to discuss this very exciting research program commitment issues within bureaucracy. So I think this is a problem that applies to any bureaucracy, any large-scale bureaucracy, because it's always very hard for the supervisor to make commitment to the subordinates. So I think the significance of this research program actually travels beyond China. So I was thinking what I can contribute most to the discussion. So instead of just trying to discuss the validity of the identification strategy or like the data source, etc., I will mostly basically raise some conceptual issues. I think this might be a more constructive contribution from me as mostly an applied theorist. Okay. So the first conceptual discussion I want to engage is about the commitment problem as the organizing theme of this research program. So if we look at commitment problem at a very abstract level, there are always two parties and there are always two stages. It's always a dynamic game, right? Because if it's a static game, there's no commitment issue. So usually party B promised to compensate party A for a cost. The party A may have to pay for an activity that benefits party B. So in many cases, party A, for example, may want to make an investment that benefits local government in multiple ways. And local government says that just come here, we will give you tax reduction, etc. Now, the commitment issue here is that after A has paid the cost, after the cost has been sunk, party B may honor or break his promise. And without a commitment device, it's actually very hard for party B to honor his promise. Right? So I think Professor Hao has given us very convincing evidence that there's a lot of issues going on in the second stage. That is, party B without commitment device will actually break the promise. So that's a key empirical finding. For example, after fiscal formalization in the Yongzheng period, later on, the central government did break its promise and began to appropriate provincial fiscal revenues. And very similar problem appears after fiscal centralization to the provincial government. And the provincial government also breaks promise and withholds transfers to the local governments. So I think this is very convincing evidence. But if we look back to the commitment problem, it is a big problem because in the first stage, party A will refuse to make such an investment, anticipating that party B will not honor the promise in the second period. So most of the efficiency cost actually comes from the first period. So that's why it's a problem. So what I think would be extremely illuminating is to find further evidence about the first stage. Do we see examples that party A actually refused to engage in this costly activity because they anticipate that party B will break the promise? So a hypothetical example in this context might be something like after Qianlong Emperor's breaking of promise, his later fiscal reforms were resisted by provincial governments. That's a hypothetical example, but that would be, I think, very interesting addition to the exercise that Professor Hao has implemented. So I think this is important because if we recall the original paper that popularizes the notion of commitment problem, that is the Douglas North and Barry Wangast paper on the British Crown, they document that, yes, without the Bill of Rights, before the pass of the Bill of Rights, the British Crown did break many of their promises to the private financiers who basically lend money to the government. But they also document that in the first stage, when the British Crown have access to this commitment device, that is the Bill of Rights, they were able to borrow much more money from private lenders. But before they have this commitment device, they couldn't borrow too much money from private lenders. So yeah, I think that would be a huge addition to this research program if such evidence actually exists. So it's the first conceptual issue I was thinking. The second one is more of a more out of curiosity. That is a standard critique that I myself encounter many times in my own research is that people will say that such commitment problem is actually should be able to be solved just by a standard folk theorem argument. That is, if party B here has really long horizon, he would be able to just honor his promise because he knows that if he does not do so in the future, he won't be able to cooperate with party A anymore. Right? So the standard folk theorem argument. So, for example, in the standard analysis of commitment problem, in many cases, we just assume that the solution concept is Markov perfect equilibrium. So we just assume away the possibility of using folk theorem. I think I'm just very curious here because if folk theorem has any bite, it should apply to Emperor Qianlong, right? Because he had probably one of the longest horizon that any emperors could possibly have. Not only because he lived so long, but because the whole succession problem has been solved by his father. So he should have one of the longest horizon ever. I'm just very curious why Emperor Qianlong did not use actually also break his promise, fully anticipating that this may cause problem for his later reforms. Yes, and finally, this is again some, I'm just being curious. This is not a critique of the paper at all. I'm just very curious that one of the defining feature of the Chinese empire is that the emperors command extremely strong autocratic power compared to other historical regimes, right? Like any European regimes, even Middle East regimes. But we do have major dynasties that enjoy quite strong fiscal capacity. So, for example, one of the best estimates about fiscal capacity in the Song dynasty say that the government was able to collect about 10% of the national GDP, and this ratio is probably constant throughout the 200 or 300 years. But the Song emperors, they command autocratic power broadly similar in the intensity to that of Qing emperor. So the commitment problem should also be very difficult for the Song emperors, but it does not seem to be a hurdle for the Song emperors to build actually extraordinarily strong fiscal capacity. And this problem should also apply to Song provincial leaders, but again, it does not seem to be a problem in Song dynasty. So I was thinking maybe there are other interesting explanatory variables there that we were not thinking about. So the last point I want to make is so I think it's very nice that the whole research program is organized around commitment, but I was thinking maybe we can also look a bit more into Pearson's framework of fiscal capacity in general. So I was thinking maybe we can also explain, especially the second paper, by borrowing some insights from Bestley and Pearson that may be worth investigating. So one of the key points is that fiscal capacity requires constant investment. You have to, for example, maintain this fish scale map and make sure that it's updated. And you have to do land census regularly. So this means that even with generous lump sum transfers from the provincial government, centralization of tax revenue to the province will reduce the marginal benefit of local government to invest in enforcement infrastructures and any other infrastructures that are very important for tax collection. So with the tax infrastructure slowly deteriorating, the local government may have to shift to other tax bases that are much less efficient and more likely to trigger revolt. So yeah, given that this whole research program is about fiscal capacity, I think it might be interesting to look a bit more into the depth of Bestley Pearson's research program. So that's all from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Weijia. So
Thank
Max, you may want to do some brief response.
Okay, very, very brief response. The first point is about in the first stage, the agent could resist the centralization endeavor from the principal. That actually happened in the turn in Jia Qing, and when Jia Qing succeeded crown, he tried to launch the reform, but he was refused by the governors. And after Dao Guang succeeded the crown, he also tried to initiate a new round of reform, but he was rejected by his governors. He actually surveyed all the provincial governors all around China, but 99% of the governors resist the reform. So, so you have the evidence on that. But in this paper, I'm gonna write anecdote, write them as anecdotal evidence. Secondly, Qianlong has long horizon. I'm not quite sure about that. Qianlong compared to Yongzheng or Kangxi, who has the longest horizon and who are more likely to renege. Actually, it was Yongzheng who made the promise not to appropriate Huahao, provincial revenues, but it was Qianlong who broke the promise. I think the problem is that when there was very urgent need, such as 大小金川 or 白莲教起义, there were many alternatives to raise the funds, right? They can sell the titles and positions, 捐纳. They could ask the salt merchants to 报销, ask the salt merchants, monopolies, salt merchants to donate money. They could use the 内务府的 retained revenue, but every time Qianlong chose to divert the shift the burden to the provinces. That may be a good question to ask. Why he chose that? He chose to renege, to break the promise. My guess is that you can always shuffle the pool of agents, right? The agents, well, some of the agents will quit, but some other agents would enter the contract. The emperor could, every time the emperor could choose from the pool of the agents who are showed a very, who are, shows best loyalty, or act as the best nucai to himself, and he can always choose from the pool. So that may be a reason why there's always a great competition for positions as governors and magistrates in Qing, which means the central government always have a greater bargaining power or something like that. That's my guess, but I haven't given deep thoughts into it. For Song's strong capacity, I think in Song also we have some evidence, anecdotal evidence, on the impact of centralization after Wang Anshi's 变法. Similar stories goes on after Wang Anshi 变法. But Song did make a different approach. Song maintained a large army. Song maintained a large size of bureaucracy. The size of bureaucracy was 10 times as much as in Qing period. There are many explanations on that. But my guess is that in Song, the central government still was constrained by this kind of commitment problem. After Wang Anshi 变法, the central government were actually resisted by a lot of provincial governors. And there were a lot of tax revolts following 王安石变法 after the formalization of the tax regime. So I don't know, but maybe that would be a good research program for the future. Maybe that's why Ming and Qing will, make a change. We will transit to another kind of regime, a low tax, small bureaucracy, and in Ming and Qing, the local government, public provision were largely outsourced to local elites. Mm-hmm. Whereas in Song, it was not quite common for that to happen. One reason is that only in the South Song, the regional, the local elites become regionalized. What's the term called? 地方化. So they have only in the South Song, the government created a pool of local elites who are willing to pay for local public goods and who are not willing to rebel. So maybe that is related to the development of Keju system, which is related to James Kong's Chen Ting's paper. But that surely is a very interesting topic to explore. Concerning the last question, I don't have good answer for that, but I will look into that person's book, Pearson Basley book. Thank you very much for the very insightful comments.
Thank you.
Thank you, Max. Thank you, Max. And thank you, Weijia. So let's turn to the Q&A. Well, here is a question from William Liu. I think this is Professor Liu Guangyin, as you mentioned in your paper. He asks, many thanks for Hao Yu to provide a clear generalization of the fiscal reforms and the failures by the imperial administration in the dynasty. I'm interested in how large is the extralegal portion in the total tax revenues collected by the local officials. Did the author has done the investigation at the county level? And how much of the locally retained 漏规 was used for local welfare rather than paying salaries or corruption? Yes.
Okay, that's a very good question. Actually, one difficulty to conduct to do this research is to measure the size of informal levies. It was quite impossible to do that. Even in modern days, it is very difficult for us to measure the size of 预算外收入, the non-budgetary income of local governments, which consists of 罚款 and 土地出让收入, many of that. But our solution to that is to use proxy, right? We use two proxies. The first proxy is the number of cases of extralegal levies, 扶收案件. So the commoners could accuse the local governments or clerks to overtax. We use the frequency, the geographic distribution and time trends of that to measure the size of informal levies. And as we can see, did I stop screaming? The size of okay, as we can see in this graph, the size of informal levy actually goes much higher after 70, 80, especially after the 18th century. So that's a indicative of what happened. And the second proxy we use is the frequency of tax revolts. So in many historical studies, tax revolts are actually a good proximate for tax burden. But other than that, I have no good solution for that. The second question is actually about how much of the income, how much of the informal levies goes to good use and how much goes to corruption. That's a very important question. However, I don't have this in the slides. After Yongzheng succeeded the crown, he asked the provincial governor to report himself what's the total income, low-grade income in total, and how much of them are actually used in good use, good ways. And in response, many of the governors report that they have like 80,000 silver taels in total, but only 20,000 silver taels are actually used to local welfare and government fees. So a rough estimate would be that at least 3/3 of the informal levies actually goes into personal pockets. That's my guess, but it is very difficult to get a very accurate figures across regions or across times. And that will depend on actually how the central government monitor the local governments. But again, how frequently central government monitor the local governments and how severe the punishment would be was actually endogenous, right? It's not exogenous. In sometimes the emperor would ask you to do more works. In other times, the emperor will ask you to be to be less corrupted. So the frequency of punishment and monitoring actually are endogenous over the Qing period. I believe Professor Chen Zhiwu and Yun Yan have this good 抄家数据 data on 抄家, and I think that's those data can provide some good angle to a process problem. That's my response.
Well, so another question from Hongjiang. I have a question about the state capacity in Qing China. As Professor Yu Hao said, state capacity in Qing China was quite weak, and to some degree, it explains the backwardness of Qing China. But it seems that Qing's autocracy was the strongest in Chinese history. There seems to be a paradox, the relation between state capacity and the government's power. It follows, how should Qing China strengthen its state capacity, presumably?
So most of the historical studies says that, such as Sun Chuanwei, come to a conclusion that the Qing state capacity was low, and it was low because of the severe principal agent problem. My research is that the central government actually tried to reform, try to enhance the state capacity from time to time. Some of the reform were successful in short time, such as 火耗归公, and some of them are less successful, and some of the endeavors are actually aborted in baby cars. I mean, they didn't even start it. So the thing is that the Qing China try to there's a strong will for the Qing ruler to strengthen its state capacity, especially when emergency comes. But in the end, they were constrained by this kind of problem that they cannot solve. That's my key takeaway message. But some of the historians argues that in Qing China, the state capacity was not as bad as it looks, because the local elites coordinated to do a lot of works for the Qing government. The Qing government they even didn't have to pay for those expenses. There are people who are paying, but I'm not gonna run into that issue. But by the most general index of state capacity, 税收占 GDP 的比重, the tax revenue as a share of national income, the state capacity in Qing was low, and it was definitely detrimental or a great obstacle to modernization, especially in late 19th century and early 20th century. I'm not sure I answered the question properly, but
good. So the last question from Wang Qing. If we consider the possibility and the frequency of provincial officials entering the power center, like becoming the ministers, will this commitment problem be different? You can just give a quick answer.
I'm not sure about I understand the question properly. I can try some heterogeneity study, something like if more central officials actually came from certain place, then the impact of the reform would be higher or lower, with more or less people from a similar region are holding position in the central government. That would be a political connection story, right? So the provincial, the people in the central government from your hometown can mitigate the impact of the centralization or strengthen the impact. I'm not sure about that, but that's something interesting to explore.
Okay. Okay, thanks. So Professor Chen, do you have any further questions or comments?
Okay, just well, thank you, Hao-Yu. I just have two quick questions or maybe comments. One is I've noticed that for this area of research, the impact of foreign or Western powers coming in, starting from the late 18th century, and then especially later on in the middle of the 19th century, the military revolution, new hot weapons came into China to play a big role, because that made the fiscal capacity problem much more impactful to the larger picture of politics and the relations between the central government and the provincial government, or provincial governors for that matter. So what I'm trying to say is that without that kind of externally brought in new technologies in terms of military, weaponry and so on, and then the competition from the Western countries replacing the northern nomadic, threats to China. So how that changed or challenged the physical structure to bring down the Qing dynasty. So that angle probably should be taken into account in order to address questions related to the physical capacity, why it was so low for the Qing dynasty and so on. My second quick question is, if it is the commitment failure problem that was behind, the low physical capacity and so on, how would this theory or this explanation be applied to explain what is happening today in China? Because I guess commitment failure, well, we know how that is, how limited or how severe it is. It's up to us, in terms of, the whole the actual situation in China today. But I imagine that given what we know, the commitment failure probably is as severe as it was during the Qing dynasty. But that has not affected the ability to raise fiscal revenue, formal or informal. So how can you apply your theory to today's China? Okay, that's quick. I'll let you.
Thank you. Thank you. Both are very good questions that I have some thoughts on. Let me go to this slide. So actually, there are demand side factor and supply side factors of state capacity. What you are suggesting is that introducing interstate competition, modern military technology into this framework. Actually, that related to the first factor, absence of interstate competition, right? That interstate competition raised the demand for larger state capacity, because in China there was no very small frequency of civil conflicts or international conflicts between 1840. That may be one reason why China chose to maintain a low state capacity. But after the Opium War, China started to build a large size of physical revenues and new source of physical revenue, such as Lijing and Haiguan Shui. But in our paper, we are arguing that those demand encountered a bottleneck. The bottleneck is from the supply side of state capacity. There were two factors related to the supply side of the state capacity. The first one is size, geographical size. China was simply too big to raise taxes. So Sun Chuanwei, actually, he had another paper concerning after Taiping Rebellion period. In our paper, we are actually talk about another source of supply side bottleneck of the weak state capacity. That is a commitment problem within the bureaucracy. We try to fit in this whole picture by adding one more elements as a supply side factor of a physical capacity. But of course, the interstate competition and modern war are important. Secondly, why China succeeded to raise state capacity in a communist era? I don't have a simple answer for that. That may be the power of a communist party, I believe. And then the power came from many sources. One source is actually covered in another paper by me and You Wuyue, which I presented in the Quantitative History conference in July. In that paper, we argue that the Communist Party are actually better agents than traditional agents in two ways. First, their power completely came from the authorization of the party. They are 贫下中农, they are poor peasants. They don't have education, they don't have lands, they don't have wealth. All things they have is the power given by the Communist Party. I mean the rural local Communist Party members, 基层党员. They are loyal to the state's agenda to raise physical revenues. Secondly, they were more constrained. These agents were actually more constrained than their counterparts in traditional era, because they are actually came from the mass, 群众. The 群众 could replace them by launch some political, actually the state actually launched a couple of reforms, a couple of political movements to fight against the local ganbu if they committed to corruption. So these agents were more constrained and they are more responsive to state agenda. That may explain why China was able to raise its state capacity in early 1950s and still today. But as I reported in the last slide, the commitment failure actually still exists in contemporary China in many cases. So that is the problem that is unsolved by the communist regime.
So,
but yeah.
So what you're saying is that it's not the commitment failure or commitment problem that really limits or constrains taxation capacity. Rather, you can have a lot of commitment failures. You just walk back from your commitments very often. That's okay, as long as you have better political mobilization and ruling elites, organizational practices that are put in place, then you're okay. Then the political and the commitment failures will not really affect your ability to raise taxation. That's what you're saying, right?
That suggests that the contract between the ruler and the agents might be different from the traditional era than in today's era. But I prefer not to go into this topic.
Okay.
In this,
thank you.
Yeah. Okay, guys. Thank you so much for the wonderful talk and the discussion. We are running out of time, so we have to stop here today. Thank you again, Professor Max Hao, for the wonderful talk.
Thank you very much for
holding
this.
Professor Weijia Li, for the discussion. So, well, in the end, let's announce the event for next week. Next Thursday, we will have a doctoral research webinar. We are very happy to invite Mr. Jinlin Wei from University of Warwick Department of Economics. Mr. Wei is now a PhD candidate there, and he will present his joint work titled "The Railways and the Cities in India." So we very much look forward to seeing you next Thursday. Well, so thank you guys again. Let's meet next week. Bye.
See you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. See you guys.